8:34. I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. So I apologize for the issues that people had getting here, and thank you all for your perseverance. Let's start with the roll call. Suzanne?
Yes. Patrick Brown.
Present.
Kim Gleason.
Present.
Tammy Colby.
Good morning.
Lyle Jepson.
Here.
Tom Lovett.
Here.
Gabrielle Lucci.
Here.
Jenna O'Farrell.
Here.
Richard Werner.
Here.
Jennifer Samuelson.
Here. Good morning.
Amira Severtson. Daniel French.
I'm
Good morning.
there. I'm here too. I just couldn't unmute myself.
Great. Okay, are there any amendments to the agenda? Right. Hearing none, we can move to the next item, which is public to be heard. And I understand that there are some people who have physically come to the meeting. I don't know if there's anyone who's calling in as well. How many people are physically present?
There are 2 people that wish to present that are here in person,
Okay.
but they will be speaking through their phone.
Okay. And then it looks like maybe someone else has their hand raised. So I guess the first person, if you can identify yourself, please go ahead. And I'm sorry, I'm not hearing anything.
We're trying to work it.
Okay, thanks.
Good morning. This is Courtney O'Brien. Can you hear?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. I'm dialed in from 802-595-4007. I am an Agency of Education staff member, and I'm here to support Secretary French for the DQS presentation.
Okay, thank you. Good morning.
Thank you.
Any other members of the public who wish to be heard?
Sorry, we're trying to unmute this phone right here. One moment, please.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, we're going to put her over here. One moment, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much.
Good morning.
My name is Amy Hornblass, and I have been to your meetings before. I think this might be the 3rd or 4th time. I've brought concerns because I've brought evidence of harms of masks, which are very well documented in the research. And recently I wrote to you because we are concerned that Kingdom East Supervisory District is still masking students, classrooms full of students and staff, based on a special education team decision. And so this is a very concerning development, and I've sent you a letter explaining how they are using the special education team to decide what medical interventions should be placed on specific students, and then also entire classrooms and teachers. So as you can see, this is a very new development, one that I'm hoping that you're aware of, and I'm hoping we can talk more about. And also, I wrote to you because I recently submitted a FOIA to the Agency of Education and learned that you have no evidence that masks are safe for kids. No evidence. And that is not surprising because there is no evidence. We don't have a single study looking at masks and kids that's more than 45 minutes long. In fact, we only have 2 of those that look at students, that look at children wearing masks for a few minutes. And what those studies show are dangerous effects. That's why it would be unethical to conduct such a study. In fact, Megan Mansell, who is a PPE expert, and also she is an expert on adapting services for students with special health needs in schools. And she actually wrote up an application to an institutional review board to see if she could conduct such a study. And guess what? The Arizona Review Board decided that it was unethical. No way could you conduct such a study because of the harms that the children would be experiencing. You'd be violating the first rule, first do no harm. So I am here to remind you, the board and Secretary French, that you not only have the authority to intervene in the situation, but you also have the obligation. And Secretary French, you have come out already urging schools to drop mask mandates. You have urged schools not to follow the CDC ratings for community infection levels because they don't apply to our small state. I am only asking you to stand by what you've already said, your very wise statements on those facts. So I'm going to cite some Vermont statutes, and whoever is taking minutes, if you can please write down the numbers of these statutes and these sections and chapters, because this is where your authority and obligation is. Vermont statutes, Title 16, Chapter 3, Section 170, control by federal agencies is prohibited. So no department, agency, officer, or employee of the United States shall, because of any provision of this title, direct, supervise, control, or prescribe in any manner the administration, personnel, curriculum, or instruction in the public schools of Vermont. So you cannot, you were right in that, Secretary French, that you can override the CDC guidance because they have no say in our schools. You do. Second of all, Statute 16, Chapter 3, Section 164, the board, the AOE board, the state board shall advise the General Assembly, the governor, and the Secretary of Education on high priority educational policies and issues as they arise. So here we are, right? I'm coming to you with that. Also, the board has the right to establish such advisory commissions as in the judgment of the board will be of assistance to it in carrying out its duties. I would say that this situation definitely, if you cannot just make an immediate decision that it's unethical, then certainly a commission would be a good step that should have been taken probably 2 years ago or 3 years ago. But here we are. Section 2943, the Secretary of Education, by virtue of the office, shall be Secretary of Education for children with disabilities and shall superintend all matters relating to the special education of children with disabilities. So I'm asking you to take the reins on this and to intervene specifically with these special education boards and their use of power in this way. And then furthermore, it goes on in section 2943 to say, the state board shall, by rule, require that whenever an individual education program requires related services, the program shall include a statement that the team has made that the determination that the services are necessary. So you have some oversight, board of commissioners, to be looking at these decisions that are being made. What is the reasoning? If there is no science saying that masks are safe and you're allowing them to do this, I would say that it is within your purview to ask for clarification and call those people in and find out what's going on here. Section number 2959. This is again under special education. The state board shall adopt rules that oversee the program requirements, procedural requirements, and responsible. So these are under special ed. So you are actually in charge of looking at those program requirements and procedural requirements. Maybe there needs to be extra procedural requirements when you're handing special education teams who are not doctors, scientists, or PPE experts permission to mandate medical interventions on any children they choose. I think there might be a way that you could put a procedural element in there to protect students. Section under rulemaking and mediation, section 2959. The state board shall adopt rules. Oh, I'm sorry, looking at the procedural requirements. Also, that the state board and the secretary shall offer mediation to parents, children with disabilities, and districts, supervisory unions, and agencies involved in special education disputes. So here we have a situation where we have a community involved in the special education dispute, because it's not just the child with a disability being affected, it's the entire classroom, the teachers, and we've had people complaining, and yet there's been no offer of mediation. In fact, as I've outlined in my letters to you, any dissent or discussion has been actually censored and dismissed and not allowed. So this is going very far beyond just just an action here. These boards are actually actively prohibiting any discussion, which gets me to section chapter 5 of 16 VSA. Chapter 5, section 8 says that the Secretary French is responsible for informing citizens of the condition of the public education system and provide other educational publicity for the enlightenment and well-being of the citizens of the state. So I think withholding information that you have no evidence masks are safe, and allowing teachers to feel that they are being backed by you to enforce these masks with students in who knows what type of manner in each particular setting and classroom, that is not promoting well-being. I feel that in order to promote well-being, you need to be transparent and honest about the facts. And chapter 42 under student rights, section 1623, freedom of expression. The General Assembly finds that the freedom of expression and freedom of the press are the fundamental principles in our democratic society, granted to every citizen of the nation. And these freedoms provide all citizens, including students, with the right to engage in robust and uninhibited discussion of the issues. And parents have been coming to school boards for the last 3 years wanting to have this discussion, and it has been not been allowed by the boards that you oversee. And finally, if we have to, we can also come to you under 16 VSA section 1700, where we can make allegations of unprofessional conduct or incompetence on the part of a licensee for superintendents and principals and administrators who are going ahead and allowing masks to be forced onto children under, we don't know what kinds of situations in these classrooms, what these children are being told about the safety of these masks. Are these teachers being informed on how to properly supervise these masks? That if students feel dizzy or have headaches or difficulty breathing, which they are likely to, that those things need to be addressed, or they're likely to experience permanent cognitive disabilities, brain damage, heart damage, and kidney damage. And if they end up with those results, guess what? They qualify for special education services. And those special education services could mandate more masking, which is actually causing the problem. Do you understand? We've got such a conundrum here, and it is so crystal clear. If the AOE is not responsible for these decisions, then who is, right? Superintendents, teachers themselves, somebody is responsible for this. And it looks like by the statutes, it's you. And Secretary French and the Board of Commissioners, my main point is that if you decide that masks are no longer required in schools under any circumstances, you're going to make so many people happy, joyous. You will be heroes. Most people overwhelmingly understand that masks are useless and that they are harmful. And that is why anytime they are given an option, most people don't wear them. Okay? So I want you to understand, we are behind you, most people. And there are a few people I know who, out of fear, are choosing to mask themselves and the children that they supervise or care for.
So
And
Ms.
that is
West, I'm
really
just going to
frightening.
point out it's almost 8:50, so
Yes, I'm sorry. So just that's my final point. Thank you. Is that they need to know. They are operating under the understanding that those masks are safe, and they're wrong about that. They need informed consent. We're bordering on criminal laws here, like strangulation, informed consent. yeah, all of these things. So thank you. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, Ms. Samuelson.
Thank you. Any other members of the public who wish to be heard?
Yes, we have one more member of the public.
Okay.
And
And we did start a little bit late, so I'm happy to run this a little bit beyond 8:50.
Yes, good morning. Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. My name is Allison Despathy. I'm from Danville, Vermont. And I, first of all, just want to thank you all so much for the hard work that you guys do to ensure good education for our children. I've taught at the Vermont State Colleges for 20 plus years, and I know what education takes and the effort and energy that you put in. So I really appreciate all of your hard work for so long. I've been involved in the Newark situation because a few days before school started in Newark, I received 5 phone calls from families. And if you don't know Newark, Newark is a very, very small school. So I had 5 families reach out to me with really grave concerns about the fact that they were told right prior to school that they were going to have to mask their children. Several families left the school, which is really unacceptable. Thankfully, choice was in place so they could go to Sutton. Other families chose to homeschool. And this is where back to what Amy was saying. Many people understand the risks with masks, physically, socially, emotionally, and with regards to educational opportunity. As Amy stated, and I don't want to reiterate, I don't feel there's the need to reiterate, there are no safety studies on masks, period. But there are decades of research looking at the harms related to masking. We have actual evidence of harm, and these range from physical harm to social emotional harm. You have children with fungal infections in Newark who are getting mask exemptions because they have vapor accumulating underneath their mask and they cannot heal wounds. So they are getting mask exemptions from doctors because they have fungal infections. There's going to be greater cases in fungal pneumonia because you cannot let go of vapor through a mask easily. We all know we have higher increases in carbon dioxide, and the exchange with carbon dioxide and oxygen becomes compromised. Our brain responds to that involuntarily. And in order for our body to then function properly, we force inhalation stronger. There are particles on masks we're sucking in, and we are affecting cardiac, renal, and respiratory health. I have a master's in science. I know how to read research. There's decades of research. So with regards to the Newark situation, we have gone, several of us in the community, well, I'm out from Danville, but we've gone to every single school board meeting trying to share this information. We're putting kids at risk. We're experimenting on children. We do not have the information to do this, and the school board can't make this decision. In going back in the minutes in Newark, I don't even think that the school board had a say in this. I feel like it was just a directive based on Section 504. And back to Section 504, because everyone keeps saying, well, we can't do anything, we can't do anything. There's nothing in Section 504 that says you can compromise other children at the expense of one child who needs an accommodation. I
Let me
respect
just
a
interrupt
child
you.
needs an
You have 2
accommodation.
minutes.
Yep, we are asking that you guys try to figure out and get involved in this situation. These families are deeply, deeply concerned about what's going on at the school. More are going to continue to leave. Oftentimes you'll hear a situation with people talking about peanuts and referring to this like, oh, this is a similar situation like a peanut allergy. That is absolutely not the case. Children can eat a lot of other food besides peanuts, but to exhale carbon dioxide and inhale oxygen is absolutely necessary for life. And when you block your nose and your mouth, you don't have another option for that to easily work and properly work in the way that it's supposed to. We are taking risks with our children. There's going to be long-term complications. There's going to be risks of asthma. And we are asking you, please step in and let's try to figure this out. There has not been a community conversation that's happened with the board, and the board, it does not seem like, has a say in this policy right now, even though they're given that broad power to do so through you guys because you trust that they're going to do what's right for the community. At this point, they feel handcuffed, their hands are tied, and they do not feel that they can take the necessary action in order to protect these children. So thank you for your time. Please, I hope if you can intervene and help the situation for the children's sake moving forward. There is no research on safety or efficacy What was that? Oh, okay. And the one last thing that Amy Hornblast was asking me to read in final here, it says in the statutes, annually with the Commissioner of Health this is Agency of Education Secretary, annually with the Commissioner of Health shall jointly inform superintendents and principals of appropriate practices regarding students with life-threatening allergies and chronic illnesses, and prepare and distribute policies, training materials, and school guidelines for managing students with life-threatening allergies and chronic illnesses, including family responsibility, school responsibility,
you're
and
at
student
time. Thank you.
responsibilities. Yes, thank you so much
you.
for your time.
Thank you. All right. Next on our agenda is to review and approve our minutes from our December 21st, 2022 meeting. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
It's been moved by Lyle
Second-
Jepson,
Seconded.
seconded by Patrick Brown. Any discussion? Hearing none. Although, oh, Tom. No, you're just getting ready. All right, all those in favor of approving the minutes from our December 21st, 2022 meeting, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
If you oppose, please raise your hand and say nay. Hearing none, the motion has been unanimously approved. And that brings us to our board announcements. I've got a couple, but are there any other board announcements before I jump in? Okay, so first, just a friendly reminder to check email. I know that there's a doodle poll that has been sent out, and if you've not yet responded to it, if you could do so, we're trying to schedule a special meeting next week, either next Wednesday or Thursday with, some time constraints. We're looking at a 2-hour meeting. So if you've not done that, please go ahead and do that. And then the other thing I was just going to point out, I sent an email last night to board members, just reminding everyone of the various subcommittees, who's on which subcommittee. I'm not really looking to, change things up dramatically, but, Richard is now with us and I'd like to slot him in somewhere. So to that end, I thought it would be helpful to just refresh everyone where you are. And if you, want to step off or join another committee, just send me an email, let me know. And then excuse me. I went back through the minutes, so I do have the authority, the way these subcommittees were created to put people on. So I think, once I hear back from you guys, we can tweak things a little bit if they need to be adjusted. So that's it for me. Any other board announcements? Great. Okay, well, at this point, I will turn it over to the student report.
All right, can everyone hear me? All right, am I going first today?
Sure.
Okay, I don't really have much to report other than that today is our first official day of our second semester in our school, and I think that's definitely a nerve-wracking but exciting change for students. I know that I'm excited because I get to take an English class this semester, so that should be interesting to get back into reading classic literature again. That'll be definitely something fun to do. But I just think it's a nice, refreshing change for a lot of students, especially the younger students that have a lot of different changing classes, as opposed to the older students that have not as many classes. But that's really all I have to report. Sorry that it's so brief, but that's all I have.
So, Gabrielle, you're a senior, correct?
Yes, I am.
Dear me, Miss Samuels, I was just raising my hand to ask that question.
Sorry, I beat you to it. And have you been on break since mid-December?
No, we actually went back a few weeks ago, but we had our exams, so we ended up having like an extra long weekend because of exams. Yeah.
Right. Any other questions or comments for Gabrielle? Okay, well, Amara, we'll turn it to you.
All right. The same as Gabrielle, I don't have much to report either. My semester has not ended yet. It ends, I believe, the 24th. Our semester ends, so I am looking forward to that. I don't have any other core classes that I take because I am just in a tech program. So I don't really have any new classes I'm really excited to look forward to, but I am really excited to graduate and start my next chapter beyond graduation in high school. So that's pretty exciting. I know a lot of people are ready for the school year to end in my class, but other than that, yeah, I don't have much to report this week.
Great. Any comments or questions for Mara? Great. Well, sometimes it's nice to have just a quiet reentry and, nothing too dramatic happening. So we'll take that as a victory. Thank you both. So at this point, we have the update on the education quality standards. So Tammy and Kim, if you want to give the update of where we are.
Good morning, and it's nice to see you all. Seem to have remedied that problem. I'll take the lead, and Tammy and Tom and Patrick fill in. We have ourselves been on a little bit of a break in trying to schedule since the holidays, but are back at it. And what we envision remaining at this time is, of course, legal review. And Tammy and I have met for the first time with our outside legal counsel. We expect that we will get specific recommendations from the special ed advice. I apologize. Let me make sure this, whatever's going on, stops dinging. We will be getting specific recommendations from the special ed advisory panel. And we hope to hear from students this Thursday as well. And that should wrap up our testimony. And we will look as a committee at formal acceptance of the proposed recommendations from AOE, from all interested parties, including the special ed advisory panel, and try and come to a stable draft of accepted recommendations over the next 2 meetings. We have also asked our committee to do a little out of meeting homework in going back through the document and looking for consistency in language and grammar and typos, but also to be clear that there's nothing else we need to address or bring in testimony on. And then I think finally, we will have the opportunity to assure some alignment with DQS and quality assurance standards when we've been able to dive deeply into both of those pieces and make sure that references to one another make sense and that we see there to be consistency. Those are the pockets of work that we've got remaining. And we hope with our committee work over the next 2 2-hour meetings, we could be at a stable draft that we would then request a special meeting of the state board to share with all of you. And Tammy, what did I miss, or Tom or Patrick?
I think you did a great job summing it up. So thank you.
Any questions? We're just really grateful for those who've come before us to share their feedback, for the collaboration with the Act One Working Group, for the time our committee has spent with this body of work. It's really important. And we are starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel so that we can have really had as much engagement as we know this work deserves in advance of asking the full board to approve and then moving into the ICAR process, where there will be another window for formal public comment. And so certainly this is not the end of it, but we felt a responsibility to make sure what we brought before you for your approval for the formal process had as much feedback to have us as a board and committee own this tremendous body of work that the Act One working group spent 18 months on. So thanks for
I
your
think the
patience.
one thing I'll
with that.
just add to sort of set the table for everyone on the full board, Secretary French and members of AOE are going to do a presentation today on DQS and the quality assurance standards. And as Chair Samuelson mentioned, we're going to be trying to schedule a 2-hour meeting next week where we just focused on DQS and the state board's role and also using that as an opportunity for feedback on the DQS. It's going to be real important that the DQS and the EQS are well aligned with one another. So as we're going through those conversations, if there are things that you flag or items of interest or places where you want to make sure things are aligned, certainly signal to Kim and myself, and we'll make sure that even in these initial conversations that we're having in our subcommittee that we're paying attention to those. Obviously, when the DQS is finalized, we'll do a formal sort of alignment with the two. But again, as we're going to have the conversations today and next week, please be listening and thinking about areas where alignment might be important or necessary, and signal to us where you want us to pay it if there's specific issues to which you would like us to pay attention. Thanks.
And then anyone, I guess, oh, I'm sorry, Jen, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay.
I was just going to say that the document that we're working from currently is the same one that we shared with you in December at that meeting. So those 3 documents have been foundational to our work, and the draft that you have has not changed. We expect it will over the next meeting or 2, but that has, even in the comment section, sort of where we stood on recommendations from other bodies. So if you are interested in a good read and you would like to offer us feedback, please do.
Well, I just wanted to say that I appreciate how methodical the subcommittee has been about tackling these changes and working to create internal and external harmony. And I realize that is painstaking work. So thank you all for your work and efforts on that. The special meeting, just to kind of forecast this a little bit, are we thinking probably early February at this point, just so board members have this on their radar?
Yeah, as Kim mentioned, we were able to counsel yesterday, and he is getting right to work. But we don't want to bring anything before the full board that hasn't had a completely review by a legal expert. The Act One working group, while they had talented attorneys on board as a part of the working group, they were not acting in their sort of capacity as a lawyer. And so given sort of the complexity and all of the, it's a complex and important document. We want to make sure that what we bring before the board is, in addition to the work that our subcommittee has done, that we've had an outside legal review of it from top to bottom, so that if there are issues that the board needs to consider where, for example, there may be gray area or there may be inconsistencies, that we can have a fruitful discussion about those at the full board level. So with that in mind, I think we're thinking early February to give, in particular, to give him a few weeks to work through this process with us.
Okay. And certainly in the meantime, board members can go through, I think with the December agenda packet, you had sort of the universe of
That's right.
EQS, so board members can be reviewing that and be ready.
That's right. That's right. And as Kim noted, we do have a few loose ends still, I would say, to sort of tidy up. We received some comments from the Special Education Advisory Board. There are some recommendations from AOE for changes that were unresolved because there needed to be some back and forth with the Act One group, but also there were some items that were identified as requiring legal counsel, and we flagged those for. So we're in the process of sort of tidying up where we have unresolved matters. And as Kim noted, the subcommittee then as individuals is going to read it through top to bottom for any other consistencies or inconsistencies. We have a grammarian on board, thankfully, who's going to catch it all, right, Tom? And, we're going to do that kind of cleanup, and then hopefully we'll have it to the full board.
All right. Anything else?
Tom smiling, please.
All All right. Well, thank you, all of you, for your hard work on this. All right. Well, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Secretary French for the update on the district quality standards and the engagement plan.
Yeah, good morning. You have a couple documents in your packet. I think they came out in the last 24, 48 hours or so. One is a PDF of a PowerPoint slides, which I think I'll share in a minute. And then the second document is draft language of the district quality standards themselves. What I thought I'd do first before I share anything is just talk a little bit about the context for this. And, part of what we're trying to do, as you already heard with the EQS conversation, is to try to bring these two things together and to maximize the opportunity for the board to inform its work on EQS, but also to give input to the agency and its work on the DQS and ultimately the quality assurance process, which is where these things will come together directly. Just to back up a little bit, particularly with Richard being a new member, I just thought I'd talk about this sort of in a general way in terms of context. There's a couple themes that I think are important to bring to the forefront as we begin this conversation. One is this idea of district quality standards emerged from a conversation around the pupil weighting system. I think most of you are familiar with that. Those deliberations worked their way through the General Assembly and ultimately last year were enacted in law. But early on in those deliberations, when I was called in to testify, as the committees, the money committees in particular in the General Assembly, were sort of trying to wrap their arms around this very complex idea of making modifications to the weights. And they were just trying to understand what was involved. I was asked at one point, well, what assurance, I'll come back to this word assurance again. It's an important one. What assurance would we have that a district that was given additional taxing capacity, not money, but a taxing capacity, what assurance would we have that such a district would actually make the investments that we would expect them to make? So, for example, if we gave a district additional pupil weights relative to students being in poverty, what would compel them actually to make those investments? And there was concern that a district, for example, under all the pressures they are with budgeting, would take the additional taxing capacity as a tax break, as tax relief for their voters, and not make the additional investments. And my early response to that was, I think we need to strengthen our regulatory framework in education, that it's inadequate. And inadequate in two areas, and they basically fall into these two buckets of DQS, which I'll quickly abbreviate, district quality standards, and we'll call DQS being one area, and the other one being a quality assurance process. So the first observation was that our education quality standards, as they exist currently, which you heard, as a result of the Act One group, the state board's been working on, are incomplete. Like, they don't include all key elements of quality. As we looked at other states, in particular, some of the operational considerations seem to be missing from our standards, and those operational issues can be essential inputs to student academic outcomes. So, for example, there's been a concern since 2007 around the quality of our school facilities. To what extent are school facilities an essential input to outcomes for students in the classroom? And I would argue they're very important. So when we looked at some of the other states in terms of their quality framework, we noticed that they had included school quality, facility quality standards as part of their construct for quality. So the idea, firstly, was that we would add on to our quality standards in terms of identifying those essential district quality mechanisms that would be important to consider. So that's essentially the genesis of the DQS. It's envisioned to be an add-on, and the law specifically identified 3 areas for which us to add on and do the work. So that's why the DQS has 3 domains: business operations, school facilities and safety, and school board governance, also another key input to the educational process. So again, the DQS was viewed as an add-on to that. But coming back to this idea of assurance, and the state's responsibility. When I say the state, I mean all of us, and particularly the agency, the formal state entity, and the state board, with its formal role, have an obligation to provide the broader public assurance that the education system is functioning well and achieving its goals of quality and equity. And our assurance framework in regulation right now, I also identified as being deficient. We have sort of an assurance process in regulation. It is essentially a continuous improvement model. So this gets down in the weeds a little bit, but the idea of continuous improvement, if you've worked in organizations, is very important, but it isn't necessarily an assurance mechanism. A quality assurance process has to talk, I think, about outcomes, whereas continuous improvement is really the process one would use to improve your outcomes. So they kind of fit together, and we think continuous improvement fits underneath the idea of assurance. It's an important approach to achieve assurance, but it is not assurance itself. The idea that you are working to improve doesn't provide us assurance that you're actually getting the outcomes we desire. So again, the two areas that were flagged as part of these deliberations around the pupil weights, the idea of adding on to the standards to include district quality standards in those three domains, which I'll get into in more detail. And then the second idea that a quality assurance process needed to be strengthened. And it's really, if we have the opportunity to strengthen the quality assurance process as this work, it might go a long way to improving outcomes for kids across the state and addressing what have been qualified often as persistent quality and equity gaps across the state. So I'm going to let me share the slides on this. I think I'll just stop at the end of each slide and invite conversation, Madam Chair, if that's okay. I think we're just trying to get people familiar to this. So, and I apologize if this is sort of repeating some content you're already familiar with, but I thought it was important to ground folks in this as best we could. Hopefully you can see that. So, getting back to the sort of rationale, and I'm going to come back to talk a bit about the role of the federal government in education. But in Vermont, we've been on this journey along with all the other states with No Child Left Behind Act, and what has been I would say, from a historical perspective, a very intrusive role of the federal government in education. I don't see that changing anytime soon. But that really has been expressed as this idea of accountability. So there's a lot we've observed in the education system in Vermont and most states that goes on in between student outcomes in the classroom and this idea of state level accountability to the federal government. There's a lot of variability in process, and those processes from an educational standpoint are expressed pretty coherently in our existing quality standards. So when I mean process, I'm talking about things like having a curriculum, local assessment, needs-based professional development, and a tiered system of supports for students. When you look across the Vermont landscape and look at how districts are enacting those processes, it stands out fairly obviously that there's a lot of variability. There's not a lot of consistency in those areas. And we started to understand this better through our work with 173, the special ed reform. So the thinking was if we could get more consistency in some of these processes, that's the issue. It's not about putting more on the education system in terms of accountability structures and more demands in that regard. If we don't attend to this variability and how districts are actually operationalizing these things, we can't expect better outcomes. And the good news, I think, to a certain extent, is this comes down to just organizing things a little better. And if we can just, improve a bit in terms of getting greater consistency on the process, I think we'll actually have significant improvement in outcomes. But the other thing, I think, as we were working not through just 173, but starting to work through the complexity of the pandemic and then the recovery, working in the post-pandemic environment, I think everyone's aware we're now seeing the effects of our demographic context play out, and issues of like the Great Resignation and just the labor shortages and so forth. That's clearly manifesting itself in even more turnover in educational staff than before. So, we had this sort of inconsistent implementation of core district processes around the state before the pandemic. And now we're layering on top of that a higher degree of staff variability. So it's an important time for us to consider introducing greater stability into these processes. If we can do that, it will go a long way to helping districts who are seeing higher degrees of staff turnover still stay focused on quality and equity for their students. So that's sort of the rationale, if you will. But this last bullet on this slide is really I think the most important reason and why we're contemplating a special meeting next week, because there's a lot of attention paid to the idea of what's in the district quality standards. Again, it's just, I would say there are three basic domains there: business operations, facilities, and board governance. But it's really how these things come together, and to really get at this problem of process instability. We think if we can strengthen the regulatory framework around assurance, that will help. Like the state's role in providing that assurance would help districts sort of align themselves better to doing some really core work more coherently, and that would go a long way, to improving outcomes. And again, as we were engaging with the General Assembly around the pupil weights, and we were looking around the country and in the region, this stands out as an area where the state is actually quite alarmingly deficient. We really don't have a strong oversight or an assurance process, and that is very atypical, I think, based on my sort of survey of what other states are doing. So this stands out to me as something we should be doing more, but I think it's also the right diagnosis for the context that we're in. I'll pause there for a minute if there's any comments or questions from board members.
Maybe you could bring it down to my level, Dan.
Sure. Yeah.
Like an example, what if you were to say this is now implemented and it's working effectively? What does that look like? Just an example, not the whole system, obviously, but there must be a piece you can pull out and say this would be happening.
Yeah, I think, particularly around the four educational processes that already exist in quality standards, I'll take coordination of curriculum, as an example. And this is the one example we talk about often. Typically, a school district anywhere in the country would have the responsibility for articulating curriculum, describing the curriculum that all of its schools would follow. And that's important. We sometimes talk about vertical and horizontal articulation, meaning that grade 3 knows what it should be doing. So when grade 3 ends, grade 4 can pick up and keep moving the students along. So there needs to be that vertical articulation up through the curriculum. Similarly, there needs to be a horizontal articulation. So if you have multiple grade 3 teachers in a school district across several elementary schools, but all those students ultimately feed into a common middle school or high school, it's important to have the horizontal articulation of curriculum. And particularly if we think about what is the state's interest in education, which I'll talk more about in Vermont, I think essentially it's quality and equity. If there's inconsistency in the coordination of curriculum, my argument would be the students in poverty are the ones that suffer the most. Any students who don't have supports at home, who really rely on the education system, for example, to teach you how to read or to have a solid educational experience, when there's not a strong articulation of curriculum, those students are at greater risk for academic failure. So if we are successful in this regard, more of our school districts will have formal articulated curriculum across all of their schools. And I will just say, it sounds like basic school district 101, and I think it is to a certain extent, but it's still a fairly new concept in Vermont. It was only in 2010 with Act 153. Act 153 was the precursor to Act 146, Act 46, where we tried to get districts to do voluntary mergers, but there was a provision of Act 153 that talked about virtual mergers, where we shifted things like curriculum. Before 2010, curriculum was a school responsibility exclusively. It was only in 2010 that we decided that, it's really important to have coordination of curriculum in a whole district, not just in a single school. So before 2010, the idea of curriculum was really only contemplated as a school level activity in Vermont. It really wasn't thought of that way in regulation. Now, some of our more strong, well articulated school districts had already thought about curriculum being a district level activity, again, leading to some of the equity issues. But I don't know if that's helpful, Kyle, to drill into a specific example, but getting more districts to have a consistent approach to curriculum would be one of the expected outcomes of a better assurance process here.
And I assume you would want, at the end of the day, if this could be statewide, that would be wonderful. And I think two examples pop out at me. One is that my experience in public education is that elementary school students often move around a lot, and those tend to be at the lower socioeconomic level. And so they don't have the continuity that I think you're striving for. And I also saw that at the tech center level, where with 7 different sending high schools that came to us, we had a lot of variation in standards, expectations, and preparation. So I couldn't agree more with both the vertical and horizontal integration you're talking about. It's a real issue.
Yeah, and it's part of what I think it's important to talk about what is the role of the state versus local school districts, and that's essentially the driving aspect of the quality assurance process is just to get a little tighter on what are the different roles and responsibilities in the education system. That's there's sometimes when you have these types of conversations, I think it's easy to say, well, there should be one curriculum statewide. Curriculum, however, needs to be responsive to local concerns and parent feedback and so forth. But I think we would say fairly readily, and I think this is obvious to any curriculum director in the state, that we could do better in the state, somewhere between the standards that are articulated at the state level and the work that districts do on coordination of curriculum. We can do more work on this as a state, and that would go a long way to addressing some of the quality and equity gaps. I'll move along a little bit. Thank you for the question.
Although it looks like Jenna also has a hand raised.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I can't see the hand, so go ahead.
Thanks. Dan, I couldn't agree with you more on everything you just said. I get the why it's important. I totally agree with you. I'm caught in my head. It's pretty exciting work, but I'm thinking a little bit around like what would be the approach of the state? You just mentioned, you kind of led right into this, talking about like the role of the state versus local in terms of what aligned curriculum looks like. Like, how would the state be involved in that? And would that be tackled kind of like a pre-K 12, or would it be kind of chunked out, looking at like a pre-K through 3rd grade project to start with? I mean, it's huge. So I was just kind of wondering if you had put any energy with your team looking at like how.
Yeah, I sure. But I think, I'm going to just sort of limit our conversation today, because the how of it is a significant topic, right? And it's mind-boggling to a certain extent of how we do it. And the good news is that kind of work is never done. So it's not like we have a curriculum and then we say congratulations and then we move on. It's never quite over. But the point with this work is just because the how of it's complex doesn't mean we shouldn't aspire to have this emphatically set up as a requirement. Because the how of it actually becomes much more difficult to achieve if we don't have a description of that expectation. And the expectation in regulation also drives the support of the agency to help do the how. So if we knew this was a requirement, and you could make the argument today that it is a requirement, it's in the EQS, for example, curriculum, but there's limited quality assurance force, if you will, in the regulation that really drives both the oversight and support functions of the agency to help districts do that work. It's one thing to say this is in regulation and feel free to work on it when you can. It's another thing to say, oh, we have a coherent description of how we're going to rate you on whether you have a quality curriculum or not. And that's going to help us. If we find you deficient, we're going to organize supports for you on how to help you get where you need to go. And if you're a new superintendent, you'll understand where your district is on that continuum, and you'll be able to sort of establish priorities based on where your district is at any given moment. So save the thought, basically, on the how of it. I just, it's important again when we think about state versus local. And it's important, and I find myself doing this a lot. It's sort of my big aha in my career. I think some of you know I started my career in 1997 as a school leader in Vermont with the advent of Act 60. I still remember those days of explaining Act 60 to voters. And I ended my career as a superintendent to date with the passage of Act 46. And the two policies are important because there's a through line in how our Supreme Court has adjudicated those issues. Act 60 was passed as a result of a Supreme Court decision, the Brigham decision. The foundational logic in the Brigham decision basically said, firstly, the state is ultimately responsible for the education of students, and that leads into a conversation of a statewide funding system. Act 46 reaffirmed that. Act 46, as you know better than anyone as state board members, there was the contention of, to what extent could the state force districts to merge? Supreme Court again said, yes, the state's ultimately responsible. School districts are themselves creatures of the state, essentially, and if the state had compelling interest to modify that structure, it could. So I just kind of sort of come back to that. Firstly, that the state's responsible. I think of that, for me as secretary, I think of simply as two words: quality and equity for all students, and the idea that this is a common benefit. But then it's important to acknowledge that the state needs to and does enact significant responsibility to local school districts. And we can talk more about why that's important. I think it's critical for the success for outcomes, for parent issues and other issues. We can talk about more detail, but the state needs to delegate significant responsibility. So this is where the assurance piece comes in. So when the state does delegate authority, the state doesn't delegate its responsibility, it delegates authority. The state needs to have some assurance that when it does delegate the authority, that delegation is happening in a manner it intended. Really, and I'm not a lawyer, but to look at the statutory framework of education in Vermont, the state delegates authority to three entities: the electorate, as I list there, the electorate approves a budget. They also have authority over purchasing and selling of real estate, buying schools, that kind of thing. But the preponderance of that delegation of authority occurs to school district boards. School boards have tremendous authority, and directly to superintendents as the CEO of those districts and also charged with the general administration. So if we just accept that logic, and I think that's true, then the DQS, which is, again, I use the acronym District Quality Standards, and the Quality Assurance, QAR, the Quality Assurance Regulation, focuses in directly on these points of delegation of delegated authority. So if we think about assurance, like as a means to drive improvement, we need to focus in on that point of delegation, and that's really the boards and the superintendents. I can't see hands going up. I'm just going to move along a little bit.
Yeah.
So in terms of this work, the General Assembly, based on these conversations, set this in motion. I think you're aware. The other sort of important thing to call out here is this is the first time the agency has been directly leading a rulemaking process. Typically, rules in education have been led by the state board. So not only did the General Assembly say go forward and requiring essentially this work to occur, the work being, again, district quality standards and quality assurance, it also directed the agency to do the work, not the Board of Education. So just to apprise you of where we're at with the work, we've been working on this definition of the standards as the first step. Again, we knew all this was going to need to come together in a coherent quality assurance process, and that's really the power of all of this work. But we needed to start by defining those district quality standards because they're new. They didn't exist before. Again, that's business operations, facilities and safety, and school board governance. All that's come together, and it's a draft still. You have a draft of it in the packet today. That's still under refinement. So we had to get that to a certain point of stability so we could then start working on the quality assurance. But we also knew once we started working on quality assurance, we'd want to go back and test our assumptions in the language that are in the district quality standards. So one of the things we did is we created this quality scale process, which is essentially we went to stakeholder groups and said, okay, here's an understanding of business operations like standards. Could you imagine it on a scale of 1 to 4, like 1 being low quality business and 4 being a high quality business? Because only through that sort of digging into it in more detail that we could understand our assumption around a definition was a good one. So we went through that through November, and now we're embarked on a quality assurance process. That too is having, again, implications for the definitions of the standards themselves. Last week, we had quite a few staff engaging with the Vermont business managers, for example, and they gave us additional feedback on the business operations standards. I will say, in terms of the district quality standards, in terms of where the work has been, in terms of creating new language, the preponderance of that work has been in the business operations domain. The other two domains were, I would say, for us anyway, were fairly straightforward. Facilities management, we took largely from Act 72. Act 72 is Vermont's policy essentially right now on school district facilities. So we took the major points out of that law, acknowledging that that law represents a considerable amount of public deliberation and stakeholder input. So we took that language. We also took the safety work that also had been vetted through considerable stakeholder input and involvement, and coming largely from what was a group constituted by the General Assembly, the Vermont School Safety Advisory Group. School board governance, I would say this was easy for the agency to do because we had great partners in the School Boards Association. So we went to them in early July and said, would you engage with your membership on this? And they did a great job of doing that. They had a lot of expertise, and they brought in some outside folks, some national level research and so forth. So we were able to bring together all the parts of the district quality standards on time, essentially in November. And the document in your packet, again, sort of describes that a little bit. But again, the real rub of this is the quality assurance process, which we've been working on steadily through December and January. Tammy and Kim has been involved in that to a certain extent. But one of the things, and this is my last slide today, and I guess it points to the reason why it would be important for the board to really focus in on this topic in a special meeting next week. I think when we anticipated the idea of the agency leading a rulemaking process and the idea of quality assurance, we were thinking a lot about the role of the board and particularly supervising the agency's engagement. I would say this issue here on this slide really wasn't brought forward on our radar as it probably should have been, because essentially when we started to think about quality assurance, a new quality assurance process, we were thinking about sort of bookends on that process. And on one end of the process, like where does it all lead at the end of the day, so to speak, that is described already in law in 16 VSA 165. And this is a significant role for the State Board of Education. And in my memory, in the 20 some odd years I've been doing this, I don't, and this language isn't 20 years old, but it is fairly old. I would say probably at least 10 years old. I am unaware of any time when the board has leveraged this language. So to a certain extent, it's new. And as you read it, it's pretty strong language. So the idea that a state board, for example, would assume administrative or direct the secretary to assume administrative control of a school or a school district, again, not uncommon in other states, but to my knowledge, that's never really been leveraged in Vermont. Knock on wood, maybe it hasn't ever been necessary. But when we start contemplating a quality assurance process, this is the end of that process, and the state board has a significant role. So then really, as we start to think about what the process would be, how do we get to that point really becomes the question. We have some ideas of cultivating local responsibility to highlight quality assurance, but the stuff that happens in the middle, what is the role of the agency in particular? That's really where I think we want to do some work on the QAR. But as soon as we started to really think about this in the context of the state board's role, it's sort of being the destination, if you will, we knew that this was a conversation that had to be surfaced more directly with the board as we're designing the quality assurance process. So that's essentially what I wanted to do today, was to not only provide you a quick update on the work, but also to surface the importance of the board's role in statute currently relative to sort of the end of the process, if you will, because I think then that implicates the board as having a more direct interest in the rest of the quality assurance process, because ultimately you're the receivers of this work. So how do we get there in a responsible way becomes a really critical point of interest for the state board. And I think talking with the chair and the vice chair of the board, that led us to conclude it'd be worthy of having a focused conversation in a special meeting in the near future. So not only, again, to get your input, to familiarize with you with this work, but also have a direct conversation about a quality assurance model. Why don't I pause there? I'll basically conclude my presentation and be welcome to participate in any discussion or answer questions.
Patrick and then Lyle.
Okay, thank you very much, Secretary French. One thing, as you mentioned, school boards, and as I looked at the document, that would very much help, because the landscape of education in Vermont is rapidly changing. There's a lot more diversity on the school boards. So I would suggest adding a page, not throughout the whole document, where the acronyms are spelled out for the benefit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point too. I should have mentioned is we started to think about the assurance process. It's assurance to who? And it's assurance to the average Vermonter. It's not, I think one of the issues stylistically I would take, additional point I take with the quality or the continuous improvement model we have now, it's really designed for internal consumption of the education system. And I think the state, particularly with quality assurance, has an obligation to provide that assurance to every Vermonter. So the language needs to be understandable. And in education, as most policy areas, we tend to use acronyms pretty quickly. So great point. Thank you.
Lyle?
And I guess my question would be, when we meet again on this, if we could talk about what your vision of the technical assistance piece would be for supervisory union schools, and would the VPA and the SBA be involved in that somehow, because they certainly have great experience. I think the capacity at the AOE will be a question, and what that might look like, and could there be a triumvirate of support out there somehow put together. So just tossing that out there for future conversation, because as I look at the draft DQS, in my former role as an administrator, I would say, geez, I don't have B3. Does anybody have a policy out there that they've adopted that will help me with that? So just technical assistance, I guess, will be my question in the future.
Yeah, I think that's another thing we're trying to do right from the very beginning of this process. Like at the very beginning, when we're having a meeting around, what are business standards? We're thinking, right up front about a quality assurance process that's doable, so it has to be manageable. It also has to put emphasis on the right things. And we also have to anticipate what are the supports that are going to be necessary to implement this. So that's as we talk about this next time, all those kind of points are really important if this is going to be successful, right? So this is not a intellectual exercise in describing quality. It's a description of how we can leverage a partnership from state and locals, but it's also to leverage the accountability, the assurance function of the state, which is non-negotiable. Essentially, the state cannot give up its responsibility, right? That's what drives quality and equity. But we can talk about the responsibility delegation and how to bring everyone up in terms of the quality of their processes. So as we explore the perimeters of what this is and what it isn't, that leads us to decisions on getting compact and tight and direct, putting emphasis on some things and not others. Those kinds of decision points you'll hear more about in the next meeting, because we'll talk about some of the where we thought the points of inflection were versus others.
Tom?
Yeah, thank you. Dan, are you envisioning new tools to collect information, or simply revisions of existing tools?
New tools. I mean, I think that has to be thought of also at the beginning of this. There's a lot of needles we're trying to thread here, but when I think about making this manageable, right at the very beginning, we have to think about how to collect and visualize the data. I mean, that's the assurance process itself, is like, think about data going on a website, a report, if you will. So whatever we need to do in terms of visualization has to be we need to be able to collect and administer that in an efficient way. To Lyle's earlier question, there's two other things that are immediately implicated in this process, and I'll talk about them more directly now. One is we need to revise our ESSA state plan. So federal level accountability is not going away anytime soon. And our agreement with the federal government and how we enact accountability, every state has a different approach to doing that. That gets approved in this plan with the federal government. This work, once it reaches a point of stability or filing with ICAR and ultimately enacted in regulation, will require us to submit a ESSA state plan amendment. ESSA is the federal law, so we know that, and we're anticipating having to do that like this spring and start working on that. The other piece of it is this has implications for the organizational structure of the agency. So the agency always evolves based on what the laws and the regulations are. We currently have staff dedicated to this continuous improvement aspect, which is in our ESSA state plan, and then focus of a lot of what we do in terms of assurance. That would have to be accommodated with this new model. So we have some work to do also on reorganizing our quality oversight functions inside the agency. As you know, the independent school approval is part of that sort of team's responsibility, but we would have right from the beginning, again, contemplating what is manageable, what is doable. But we have flagged already that this would necessitate us submitting an ESSA state plan amendment, and it would require some reorganization among our quality oversight functions in the agency.
Thank you.
Dan, can you forecast when we meet again at our special meeting next week, what is like, how do you envision the work that we're going to be doing? And I'm wondering, like, if you're looking at, the state board as the last step in the quality assurance process, are we kind of working to sort of build in that middle ground where the agency, like, are you looking for input from the board about, what that middle ground looks like? Or if you could.
Yeah, I have some, I have basically a one-pager matrix that I test sometimes with different groups to get reactions. I think that's the efficient way to do it. So I think that's the document I would use. I'm going to use it tomorrow with the statewide meeting of the superintendents to provoke their reaction. We just finished a couple days of focus work, and I think that holds up pretty well as a mechanism. I'll use the word provoke, to provoke questions and comments. I think if I did that with the board, it would be useful. I think one of the, I'd start to surface some design questions that I'd want you to think about. One would be, certainly, that language in 165 that I had on the screen is old, I think. To what extent does it feel like it's still useful? Does it need to be changed? Basically, should we be surfacing some recommendations to modify that language at some point? But then, I think the critical point, because we're going to make some decisions again about what things to emphasize and what not to emphasize, how comfortable does the board feel about that through that? Again, you're ultimately the recipient of a recommendation from the secretary that has pretty significant implications. That kind of recommendation needs to be on really solid ground, so to speak. So that starts to winnow out some of the more subjective measures that we have in standards, and tends to lead to a focusing on things that can be really measured and have really important implications for students. But to walk through that a bit with the board and to understand where you feel comfortable or uncomfortable and where we should put more emphasis, I think will be a central part of the conversation in that meeting. But I think using that sort of one-page matrix, it's actually 2 pages, I think, but I call it a one-pager, will be a helpful tool. I put that in your packet ahead of time, and I'll use that to sort of stimulate the conversation. Maybe include some design questions that I'd like you to think about. You're on mute, Jennifer.
Thank you. I think it would be helpful too to pull out 16 VSA section 165, just so that we can see what the law
Yes.
is requesting of the state board.
Yep.
And,
I have that kind of embedded in the chart. I have it broken out a bit, in terms of what the secretary needs to do versus what the board needs to do. But I think that'll be featured prominently in the work that we talk about. Might be
Other-
good homework for the board to read that on their own a little bit too, if you get a chance.
Yep. It's not that long. Any other questions, comments, considerations?
So again, twofold. If you have feedback on the specific content of the DQS, we're open to getting that feedback. That's ongoing. You could send it to me individually. Like Patrick, you had some thoughts there on acronyms. We have Courtney mentioned, she's on the call today. Courtney's been sort of holding this project internally inside the agency. So Courtney captured your feedback today, Patrick. So any comments like that you have, but you feel free to email me directly, and I'd be happy to take those back to our team. And then for next week, we'll, or whenever that special meeting is, we'll really be listening to your feedback very directly on that, because I think that's really where the board has a really critical role. And thinking about particularly for Kim and Tammy, who have probably greater fluency in the Act 1 revisions to EQS, thinking about the implications for that work relative to the QAR process would be really important. So we have this now contemplating this new expansion of EQS in response to the changes going on in our society. How are we going to provide assurance that those things are actually happening, right? Those represent a pretty significant change, and I think it's an opportunity to leverage a new quality assurance process to make sure those we're comfortable with the state's responsibility in those areas.
Anything else on this agenda item? If not, Dan, thank you very much. This, I think, was a really good setting of the table for our discussion next week. And, sort of hearing that background again, I think was really helpful. So thank you for presenting that. All right, so next up is our break, unless, Tammy, would you want to jump ahead to item J and take up roles and responsibilities before we go to break?
Sure, happy to. I didn't have a lot to say there, other than, in conversations with Jennifer and with Dan, I think there's an interest in the board now revisiting some of the work that the Roles and Responsibilities Committee did in collaboration with AOE last year, around starting to think about sort of how do we get more specifics about that would attach to the plan that we proposed to the board at that time. And as a reminder, really what we were talking about and what came out in terms of recommendations and what the board supported last year was to really rethink sort of how it is that the agency and the board would work together, where would be, what would be the roles of the agency, what would be the roles of the board. And we created a framework, a 6-part framework for thinking about and organizing that conversation. But at the time, that was just the framework. And we, as a board, discussed the framework. And I think we came to some agreement around the fact that the framework made sense. There's a lot of detail that needs to be worked out, right, in terms of operational detail for how this might work. And so the conversation that Jennifer and Secretary French and I have had is that we need to reconstitute that working group or subcommittee to work with the agency just start to think about what the details would look like. With an eye toward, I know there's some interest on the part of the legislature in potentially trying to codify some of these recommendations in statute this session. So I think that was sort of the update, which was, there's an interest in revisiting this to the extent that we need to sort of start to flesh out some more detail around sort of how we might implement that framework in practice. Jennifer, did I jump in? Dan and Jennifer, please jump in. That was sort of, I think, the big picture there.
Well, just to back up here, I mean, it used to be, and just as a refresher, it used to be that we did not have a Secretary of Education. We had a Commissioner of Education who reported directly to the State Board of Ed. When that changed, the Secretary has now been appointed by the governor, reports to the governor. But a lot of the roles and responsibilities that are, still remaining on the books, some in statute, a lot in our rules, really need to be clarified in light of this, shift in governance structure. So I think that was the work that many of you recall, Tammy was kind of spearheading last year, and we did have the Roles and Responsibilities Subcommittee. So Tammy, the work that you guys did last year was you established the framework with the 6 buckets and sort of conceptually the state board and the agency reached some sort of agreement on the framework, but not necessarily the details. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And again, there was a 6-part framework. I do have the slides here. If I can pull those up to remind people what that framework was. Let's see. Oh, I don't have the ability to share. I can email around those slides. They're the same slides that we presented to the board last year. But again, the idea, where we started with is, what would this framework be broadly? Where do we see the roles and responsibilities of the agency aligning with sort of the strategic priorities? Where do we see the roles and responsibilities of the board aligning with strategic priorities? How would the board and the agency collaborate with one another and work, toward a common goal without getting in each other's way, right? How can we make sure that these two entities are complementary and cooperative? But it was a framework. And there's a lot of detail that we need to work out, particularly around the rulemaking process for how this would actually be implemented going forward. And, I think there's interest now in, especially, we've had some experience with the DQS process and, we've been working on the EQS and the 2200 series and to sort of really start to think about what this would look like in practice if we wanted to sort of codify some of these things that we've been trying out over the last year since we came up with the framework.
In timeline, I know that we're sort of in the thick of DQS, EQS, and quality assurance. This is something where, reconstituting the Roles and Responsibilities Subcommittee, this is work that would probably start maybe late February and carry on through the spring. Is that?
I think that makes sense. I think that many of the people who are involved in the EQS subcommittee are also, well, at least one person, me. But I think depending on sort of how we reconstitute that committee, there's a lot of work going on before the board with respect to EQS and DQS over the next few weeks. I think it would be hard to start doing this at the same time. Just because we're all taxed with capacity. And so the idea, I think, would be to reconstitute the committee to really get down to having these more concrete discussions around how do we operationalize this framework and starting that at the end of February and into March.
Okay. And Dan, from the agency's perspective, does that timeline seem realistic and reasonable to you?
Yes, I'm thinking largely about needing to be responsive to deliberations in the General Assembly, and I think so far, the governor's budget address is on Friday. I think that's sort of the last piece before we really engage directly on priorities inside the General Assembly, but I know this issue will come up. I think we've been asked for a couple times to talk more about the DQS. I think I will be talking about it in the General Assembly this week. I think anytime we start talking about the DQS and the quality assurance, it provokes a conversation about roles and responsibilities. So I think that timeline sounds fine. We just need to be prepared. I would prefer to always go in together on those kinds of issues and not be, going in individually and saying different things, kind of stuff. But yep, sounds great.
Good. Okay. Lyle?
Tammy, I'm looking at a report. I think it's a draft report from February 12th of 22. I assume there was something after that, but I don't have it saved here. And if not, maybe before the committee meets, I'd love to see your slides. And
Yeah,
Any
I can
other-
share back out when we pull the committee back together, the report was finalized. I think the draft report we presented, the group pulled together and we presented it to the full board. I think the final report was submitted by the agency because it has to be formatted. So I don't know that I have that Word document. I'll get it from the agency, but it substantively it wasn't changed. So I'm happy to, when we start to pull the group together, we will go back and look at the report. We'll get the slides together and all of that. But I think the interest today was in just raising the issue that with the board that we have more work to do on this. And we knew that last year when we sort of got to a stopping point and socialized those findings with the legislature last year. All of us recognized at the time that we had gotten to here, but that we needed still to go to there. And so when in thinking about today's meeting, just wanted to raise our hand, raise the issue or set the table, so to say, it's time we need to return to this now and start to flesh out some of the details.
Thank you.
Kim.
Thank you. And thanks for sending that around, Tammy, because it's a little bit distant in recalling where we were on that. So my question is, as a legislature, and to Dan's point, may ask for responsiveness in the meantime before this board has revisited this topic, how do we respond? Or how do, I guess, you all respond, and what does that look like?
Yeah.
And maybe even more broadly with respect to requests from the legislature for comments on things that we haven't discussed as a board recently.
Yeah. At this point, when there has been a request, we have a presentation that we presented to that the board approved last year, right? That we presented to legislature that gives the framework. The only commentary that's been going back and forth with the legislature is to sort of resubmit or sort of, because there's new legislators, that same presentation at this point. So I wouldn't imagine that there'd be any more discussion of detail beyond the framework that we already discussed as a full board. I think part of the purpose of getting the subcommittee together is so that we can start to think about the implementation of that framework. But obviously, I would think that any of the decisions by the subcommittee or recommendations of the subcommittee would come back to the full board for the full board to sign off on before anything was proposed to the legislature. I don't know about the larger comment. I think there's also a second question there about sort of, legislative conversation. I'll defer that to Jennifer. But with respect to the roles and responsibilities, there wouldn't be no new information generated for the legislature other than what the board has already approved and has seen, which is the same slide deck from last February or March.
Yeah, and I think there's just been recognition that we're asking the legislature to help us sort of finalize this, shift in organizational structure with the Agency of Education. So if we're asking for help to accomplish that, what's clear is that we still have some work that we need to do before we can go back to the legislature to say this is what we're proposing. So this would be our opportunity to come back together, work with the agency, and hopefully come up with something that everyone can live with.
Yeah, the intent last year was not to have something that was ready to pull off the shelf to go into statute. Where the milestone that we hit last year was we agreed on a framework, right? That made a lot of sense, at least to the subcommittee, and then we talked about that with the full board. But there's a lot more discussion about sort of how we might operationalize that framework. And that would be the kind of detail I would expect that the legislature would like to have, but we don't have that detail because we haven't had those conversations at this point. And I would think that any of that detail that came out of our discussions in a subcommittee would come back to the full board before it would be socialized with the legislature.
Right. Well, we are just past the 10 o'clock mark. If there are no more questions on this, I think it would make sense to take our break and then come back at 10:15.
And I'll send around the slides again from last year on the rules to the full board and CC Maureen so they can go back up on the website. But there's been no changes to those slides.
Great. Thank you. All right, so please turn off your cameras, turn off your microphones, and we will be back at 10:15. So the next item on our agenda is a possible executive session. And Suzanne, are we ready with that?
Yes, we are.
Great. Oh, and do we have Jamie Craybill with us as well?
Yes, we do.
Terrific. Okay, so at this point, Gabrielle, I believe you've got a couple of motions to read.
All right, can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I will start with the first motion. I hereby move that the board finds that premature general public knowledge of confidential attorney-client communications made for the purpose of providing professional legal services to the body with respect to pending litigation to which the board is a party would clearly place the board at a substantial advantage.
Disadvantage. Just a friendly.
Oh goodness, I'm so sorry.
So it would place the board at a substantial disadvantage.
Disadvantage. Thank you, Jennifer.
All right, so that is the motion. Is there a second? And seconded by Tammy Colby. So this is for the purposes of meeting with Assistant Attorney General Jamie Craybill to discuss litigation to which the State Board of Education has been named as a party. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of, oh.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I just want to point out I'll recuse myself from participating in the executive session.
Thank you. Kim, did you have a question? Okay. All those in favor of approving the motion, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any nays? Okay, hearing none, the motion has been approved. And that brings us to our second motion.
I hereby move that the board go into executive session to receive confidential attorney-client communications made for the purpose of providing professional legal services to the body with respect to pending litigation to which the board is a party pursuant to 1 VSA sections 313A1E and 313A1F.
Right, so you've heard the motion. Is there a second?
I second that.
Seconded by Patrick. Any discussion? Okay, hearing none, all those in favor of adopting or approving the motion, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed, please signify by saying nay and raising your hand. Okay, hearing none, the motion has carried. So board members, at this point, Suzanne has sent a link to the executive session. So I'm going to ask you to leave, like actually leave this meeting and then click into the executive session, and we'll meet with Assistant Attorney General Craybill. And then when we are done meeting with her, we will then return to this meeting. So at this point, I'm going to leave and I will see you guys in executive session. Thank you. All right, so it looks like we've got a quorum. So we are back in the public part of our meeting. And Gabrielle, I believe you have another motion to read.
Yes. All right, here's the motion. I move that we grant to Board Chair Jennifer Deck Samuelson the authority to execute a settlement agreement on behalf of the State Board of Education in the matter of Valenti versus French.
For the motion, thank you. Is there a second?
Patrick, I second that.
All right, thank you, Patrick. Any discussion? Okay, hearing none, all those in favor of adopting the motion as read by Gabrielle, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
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 If you disagree, please signify by raising your hand and saying nay. Any abstentions? Okay, hearing none, it appears that the motion has been approved. Thank you all very much. Okay, so that takes us to the next item, which are the independent school approvals. And at this point, I will turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Jennifer. We will be proposing, our committee will be proposing the approval of 4 schools. And I'll take each one of them in order as they are in your packet. So for the first motion that I'd like to make is that we accept the secretary's recommended action and grant renewal of general independent school approval to Orchard Valley Waldorf School of East Montpelier to serve students in grades K through 8. This will be a 5-year approval through June 30, 2027. Notice that because their formal approval would have expired in 2022, that's why the 2027 date. And you'll hear that for others as well, that 2027 is the June 30, 2027 is the date. Orchard Valley Waldorf School is committed to the Waldorf model of education. It's serving 54 students in grades 1 through 6 right now and 11 in kindergarten. They're growing back their 7th and 8th grade program after COVID. Their school is community-based, a lot of parent involvement, personalized education. It's based on a large campus, a farm, lots of green space, so a lot of that outdoor nature-based education that Waldorf is famous for. Very non-hierarchical form of governance, has faculty members on its board, as I said, lots of parent involvement, and a lot of collaborative meetings over the direction and the state of the school. They did sign the addendum, and so I can speak a lot more about that school. We met with Natalie Betcherer, who was the head of school, and she answered our questions. I think you've seen the report from the agency staff, but the committee and I are available to answer any questions you might have before we vote for approval.
So this isn't a substantive question, but the reports that came out with this batch of schools seems different. Like it seems like it's laid out differently. And I'm just curious because I found it a lot easier to read and tie the findings back into the language of the rules and the framework that we're working under. So thank you. I thought it was a much easier to follow presentation.
Thanks goes to the agency staff.
Any questions or comments about this approval application? All right. So Tom, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, so I've made the motion that we accept the secretary's recommended action, that we grant approval, general independent school approval to Orchard Valley Waldorf School in East Montpelier to serve students in grades K through 8 for a period of 5 years through June 30, 2027. This approval is conditional on the requirement that the school reports to the Agency of Education within 5 business days whenever any changes occur in enrollment programs, policies, facilities, financial capacity, staffing, or administration during the approval period.
Thank you. You've heard the motion. Is there a second? Seconded by Jenna. Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor of approving Tom's motion, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any nays, please raise your hand and signify by saying nay. Any abstentions? All right, the motion has carried. Thank you.
The next school is Highland Hall, and I will be, our committee is Moving to accept the Secretary's recommended action of granting renewal of general education school approval to Highland Hall in Bennington, Vermont, to serve students ages 5 through 13. Also for a 5-year approval period through June 30, 2027. Highland Hall is currently enrolls 39 students. Also a very community-based school with parents and interested community members very involved. It's a Dewey school formed on the philosophies of John Dewey. A wide variety of learning opportunities with both age and ability grouping. Displays of student work, celebration of student work were all throughout the school. The staff witnessed advanced instruction in math and literacy. The school's divided into three bodies, the lower elementary, the upper elementary, and the middle school, but they have also signed the addendum.
Board members, any comments or questions? Kim?
And I apologize for not, there were so many of them when I was looking at them last night. I had a couple of questions. This notion of being approved for general education is seemingly no longer relevant come July 1, 2023. And am I misunderstanding? Because to receive public tuition after July 1, 2023, all schools must be able to serve students with special needs. Am I understanding that wrong?
I think you may be correct as of this July 1. I think the recommendation now is made for general independent school approval, which is currently the still the rule, I think. Am I wrong about that?
No, you are correct. I mean, they're being approved under the current version of the rule, right? I mean, we can't prospectively grant or deny approval based on rules that are not yet in compliance. But I mean, it does go back to, I think there needs to be a mechanism, and Dan, maybe you can speak to this, about independent schools, approved independent schools who will need to comply with all of Rule 2200 rule series in order to continue to receive public tuition. And whether there are some schools that, may not continue on receiving public tuition, and, how we're going to capture those schools, as of July 1st.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that today, but it is something on our radar that we have to work on the transition.
And along those lines, the addendum specifically states that it is it's for schools seeking initial approval or renewal of approval. So there would have to be a different kind of attestation as of July 1.
And I think it may also, I think that the forecast and the expectation of being approved to receive public tuition requiring compliance and ability to serve students with special needs for July 1, 2023 has been an expectation for years now. And so while we may not know mechanically how we're going to go about ensuring that after July 1, those that are receiving public tuition are just those that are able to serve students with special needs, that mechanical item is not like springing on anybody who's otherwise an approved independent school. The expectation, if they want to continue receiving public dollars, they need to comply with the full extent of the rules. So I think I needed to say that out loud for my own sake, because I think we probably do need to know what that mechanism is going to be whenever your team knows what that's going to look like. That would be helpful at the AOE. It will help us also think about the parts, the attestation for those that are currently approved and not up for renewal on the parts of the rules that already apply. So those several areas regarding non-discriminatory practice and the Public Accommodations Act. So we may have some work on our part regarding guidelines about how that works for those rules that are already in effect, those parts of the rules already in effect. And then it sounds like the AOE will have some mechanism for ensuring after July 1, public tuition is only going to those that comply with all aspects of 2200. Am I getting that right?
If you remember, Kim, earlier the agency said they were going to send out a notification to schools that this is coming, so it would actually be in writing. It's not a surprise that these will be the changes of July 1, as they did earlier when we were approving the first round of changes.
I'm thinking from a budgeting standpoint, all these schools probably need to have a clear sense of whether or not they're going to be able to receive public tuition. So, and again, that we are approving for renewal or newly for 3 or 5 years does not, there's no end run around the requirement for July 1, regardless of their approval status. Can I just confirm that that's true?
And I'm sorry, can you say that again, Kim?
I just, as we're approving all of these independent schools, and we're thankfully to Tom and others and the folks at the agency moving off of the backlog of approvals, doing so in advance of July 1, 2023 does not change the requirement that that category approved to receive public tuition becomes effective July 1, 2023 for everybody, no matter what their approval status is. And so I guess I didn't mean it to sound flip, but I'm sure it did. That end run, we're not doing an end run around by approving people before July 1. They will still have the obligation to attest that they are able to serve students with special needs to be approved to receive public tuition, regardless of what we do today.
Yeah, so if someone is getting approved today, it's not like they get a buy for the next 4.5 years.
Okay, thanks. I just needed to say it out loud. Thank you.
Jenna?
I don't know. I think maybe this should be an agenda item. It's just moving forward as a backup plan. How many schools are we talking about? How many special educators would need to be hired? Because I think that's independent school. That's the expectation, right? That you have a licensed special educator. For special ed schools, that's the requirement. That's providing services and case management, or for a part of the day for services as they're dictated in an IEP. You have to be prepared for that. I don't even know if there's that many special educators in the state of Vermont that would be able to put in all these independent schools at this moment.
So my understanding is that it's not like every independent school has to have, an army of special educators, standing by. I think it's that they have to be ready, willing, and able to educate any student with special needs and have a plan in place for how that education will occur. And I think the number of special needs students within the state isn't going to change. It's just going to be a matter of where those students are being educated and how we are going to ensure that their services are being met.
Yeah, I think that's tricky because I think that it's all up to the IEP team, right? Like, as we say, oh, that might never happen. It can happen, and it's just problematic. And I don't know if there's any technical assistance on how to help independent schools plan or think about services, right? Like that army of standby. Like, what's your plan when somebody wants to attend an independent school that has an IEP, that has services in every content area provided with specialized instruction, and the independent school now says, oh, we're not gonna be able to take you. So I think
the answer
I'd be a little worried, that's all.
So I think our rules are pretty clear about this, Jenna. I think we did think about this. In the rules, there's a whole process between the LEA and the independent school about how to provide services. And there's a dispute mechanism. I mean, there's this is in pretty great detail in the rules as they're currently written. Maybe we need to revisit it. I don't know, but they're set to go into effect July 1.
Right. Maybe I'm just overthinking. I'm overthinking the staffing. That's all. And the shortages that we have right now. And
my understanding is there's still an obligation by the LEA, and maybe we need to, as Jenna suggests, just put it on the agenda so that we can all be brought up to speed on what that is.
And I think, again, I'll just say that 173 isn't new. As a matter of fact, if anything, the timeline for compliance had been delayed with the pandemic. So the expectations have been clear for a long time in the law. The rules have been in place with a delayed implementation for independent schools with respect to special education. And this third category of approved independent schools to receive public tuition, eligible to receive public tuition, has been out there in the universe since the rules were filed. So and to be in that category, you must be able to serve all students, including those with special needs. And I think there are some guidelines around what that looks like. I think you may not be wrong, and I wouldn't know. I don't think the legal licensure question, and so I would agree it might be helpful as this deadline is looming that we as a board are better informed about what that means and what that would look like. I'm not exactly sure, to your suggestion, Lyle, that there could be no one with special ed expertise in an independent school that says they're going to serve students with special needs. I don't think that is just I don't know what that would look like in a force in from an LEA. I don't think that absolves the approved independent school to receive public tuition.
But Kim, that's what our rules say. There's a whole process for how independent schools and LEAs can negotiate services for students. That's what our rules say.
Okay, so I think it'll be helpful for us to be all maybe reminded of this and understand what that looks like in practice. But I mean, that being said, there has to be some degree of expectation that all students can be served within the environment in the approved independent school if they're going to receive public tuition.
So I think for where we are right now, we're dealing with one school.
Right. There's a motion on the table.
With a motion on the table. And I think, once, July 1st happens and we're under a new set of approval, our process is going to look very similar to what we're doing right now. It's just, there's going to be an additional attestation. And I think the mechanics of ensuring that schools are going to, ready and able to be in compliance with those new rules that go into effect July 1st. And Dan, I don't want to sort of speak for you, but this seems like an agency issue that, that the agency would have that first level of oversight before it would come to the state board. So to the extent that maybe the agency is doing anything to facilitate that, or whether you feel like it's not within, your realm of responsibility, I'll pull the question back there first. I don't think it's something that the state board is going to be in charge with rolling out.
Yeah, I would just be happy to put this on the agenda for the future. I think right now my observation, we're taking a lot of time on an issue, and you have a separate series of actions to take on approvals. Notably, Manchester Village School, which is coming up, has accomplished this through having the head basically obtain the special ed endorsement. So I think it'd be worthy of putting this as an agenda item and just bringing everyone up to speed about what the new regulations say and what they don't say, instead of taking this up now in the middle of a focused deliberation on approval.
Yeah, I'm happy to vote, but I just needed to understand that this doesn't slide in under the expectation and now there's a 5-year approval. The expectation would be that they'll comply with the full extent of the rules come July 1, as will others, and there'll be some mechanism to do that. And the list on the website that has approved independent schools will now have another category, approved to receive public tuition. And I would expect a July 1 looming deadline would be helpful to understand what that mechanism looks like, so that all schools can be prepared to be providing that attestation or otherwise, so that LEAs know what to do about where they're approving placement of their students. So, and the others that were focused on approval with special ed categories weren't as big a concern because they're already providing special ed. And as I reviewed those that were being asked to approve now, so that was my frame of reference on that.
Okay, so to bring it back to Highland Hall, we have a motion on the table. Is there a second? Seconded by Jenna. Any further discussion?
I'll just read the full motion.
Yes.
That the State Board of Education accepts the Secretary's recommended action to grant renewal of general independent school approval to Highland Hall of Bennington, Vermont, to serve students ages 5 through 13 for a period of 5 years through June 30, 2027. This approval is conditional on the requirement that the school reports to the Agency of Education within 5 business days whenever any changes occur in enrollment, programs, policies, facilities, financial capacity, staffing, or administration during the approval period.
All right, so you've heard the motion. It's been seconded by Jenna. Any further discussion? Okay, hearing none, all those in favor of approving the motion, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, the motion is carried. Thank you.
The third school is the Manchester Village School and Manchester Center. Again, I'm going to, our committee recommends that we approve the Secretary's recommended action, which is to grant renewal of general and special education, independent school approval to Manchester Village School and Manchester Center, Vermont, to enable the school to serve students in grades 1 through 12 and to add a disability category of multiple disabilities to its current disability category offerings. Again, for a 5-year approval through June 30, 2027. So Manchester Village School is a general education and special education school, again, serving grades 1 through 12. They have a welcoming facility, individual instructions. Many of the best practices that the AOE has been promoting are in place at Manchester Village School. They have plenty of green space for children outside. They employ 3 special educators out of a total of 7 educators. They have a slew of extracurricular opportunities. And almost all the intent is that almost all of the students, and all but 2% of their students transition back to their home school. So that's their goal, and they're very successful at it. They are a for-profit school, and they have signed the addendum.
Tom, the one question I had is in the agency's report, there's something kind of toward the bottom of page 6 that the agency recommends that the agreement also clarify what services are included in tuition and what additional services, if any, are required to meet student needs. And I don't know if that's something that has already happened or if it's going to happen. And I mean, it didn't seem like either the secretary, it doesn't seem like the secretary or the subcommittee is recommending that the school not be approved. I'm just sort of curious what happens with that recommendation.
My understanding is that it's happened. It's not an uncommon circumstance between LEA and a sending school and a receiving school, that in the special education agreements, the contracts, that they clarify what's being covered and what's not. And the recommendation here was that they become more clear,
Okay.
But that's already happened, my understanding.
Kim?
Could we make that addendum then to the approval? The amendment, an amendment to the approval to include that the agreement clarify what services are included in tuition and what additional services, if any, are required to meet student needs. added to the end of the approval motion.
I don't see any reason why we couldn't, since my understanding it's already been done.
Okay, and that will ensure that that is an ongoing expectation. So I'd like to make that amendment to the motion.
Is there a second to Kim's proposed amendment? I think procedurally we have to second a motion to amend.
I will second the amendment, Rich Warner.
Any further discussion?
Patrick Halliday just jumped on. I don't know if he has an answer to the question. Has it already been done? I don't know if that's why Patrick. Oh, and he just left. So
no, I'm sorry. Actually, I don't have an answer. I must have accidentally hit the camera button. I don't have an answer to that question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Lyle, for my sake, I was just saying if it's a recommendation that it happen, then if we state it in our motion for approval, it will happen if it's not already. And if it has already, there's no, concern either way. So that was my point in putting it there.
And I'll just say that it might even be in the Kendall Farm report too.
I saw it as well.
That it's fine to put it in there as part of the motion. It's a tricky conversation between the two. I know from experience about what's covered and what's not, but I think it's worth putting it in there if the board feels that it's necessary.
Okay, so Tom, can you reread the motion as amended?
I haven't. I'll try. The committee recommends that the board approve the secretary's recommended action of granting renewal of general and special education independent school approval to the Manchester Village School in Manchester Center, Vermont, to enable the school to serve students in grades 1 through 12 and to add the disability category of multiple disabilities to its current disability category offerings. This approval is for 5 years through June 30, 2027. This approval is conditional on the requirement that the school clarify what services are included in tuition and what additional services, if any, are required to meet student needs, and that the school reports to the Agency of Education within 5 business days whenever any changes occur in enrollment, programs, policies, facilities, financial capacity, staffing, or administration during the approval period.
Thank you. Is there a second? Seconded by Tammy. Any further discussion? Okay, hearing none. All those in favor of approving the motion, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, the motion is carried. Thank you. Richard, your hand is raised.
Yeah, I just, my town moderator hat on. Don't you have to vote the amendment separate to change the motion and then vote on the original motion?
Well, I think we you can correct me because you probably know Robert's rules much better than I do. I thought when Kim moved to amend the motion and then, but we didn't vote. We just moved and then seconded. Okay. So remind me again, where are we now?
Well, I thought we would need to vote on the amendment first and then that amends the original motion.
Okay. So we've already adopted the motion. Can we retroactively approve?
I should have asked ahead of time. If you guys are all good, I'm good. I just was learning.
Yeah, no. I'm glad you raised the issue. Can we retroactively vote on the amendment and then ratify the vote that we just took?
Well, I kind of think you did because you voted you voted on the amended motion, but I just think now that becomes the main motion.
Okay.
We did, yeah. We didn't defeat we didn't vote down the original motion. We just voted in the amended one.
Right. So do we need to do anything to button up what we've just done? Or are we good?
You know, it was just a question. If everybody's good, I'm good.
Well, and I see that Emily's on the line. So Emily, I don't know if you have an opinion about if we need to correct anything that we've done.
No, I think you're okay. I think the record shows what you voted on, and it seems to be what you intended to pass.
Okay, thank you. All right. So thank you for that point, though. I'll keep that in mind the next time. So Tom, back to you for the last one.
Okay. So this is for the Kendall Farm School in Newfane, Vermont, where our committee recommends that we approve the secretary's recommended action of granting renewal of general and special education independent school approval to Kendall Farm in Newfane, Vermont, to enable the school to serve students in grades 2 through 12 and to add the disability category of speech language impairment to its current disability category offerings for a period of 5 years through June 30, 2027. I will make a fuller motion after I talk a little bit about the school. So Kendall Farm has 17 students in their one-on-one, their individualized program, and 22 students in their milieu-based program. They're approved for 50 seats total, and they are committed to a 1-to-3 ratio of adult to students. Lots of hands-on, project-based, community-based learning. The agency staff saw a group of students earning their chainsaw certification when they visited. They also observed math instruction, which they think is representative of what goes on at the school, also showing many of the best practices recommended by the agency. It's a designated agency school by the healthcare and rehabilitative services, which allows them to offer a full range of therapeutic services to their students. There was a note in the report about attendance, and Kendall Farm, Drew Gradinger, the head, went into great detail about trying to get these students who are struggling with school anyways, to get them come during their COVID years and the COVID fallout. But they do work hard, making home visits, and are successful largely, although there are some students, a few that are having trouble with attendance. So he did address that concern. They did sign the addendum, and the same thing that I'll say about Manchester Village School. These schools have been in place for a long time, and they have excellent relationships with their LEAs. But there was that recommendation that from the agency to clarify what services are included in tuition and so forth, which I will add to the motion when I make the longer one.
Should you do the motion and then we'll second and ask questions?
Sure, sure.
If you don't mind.
So I move that the State Board of Education accept the Secretary's recommended action and grant renewal of general and special education independent school approval to Kendall Farm in Newfane, Vermont, to enable the school to serve students in grades 2 through 12 and to add the disability category of speech language impairment to its current disability category offerings. This approval is for 5 years through June 30, 2027. This approval is conditional on the requirement that the school clarifies what services are included in tuition and what additional services, if any, are required to meet student needs. And that the school reports to the Agency of Education within 5 business days whenever any changes occur in enrollment, programs, policies, facilities, financial capacity, staffing, or administration during the approval period.
So you've heard the motion. Is there a second? Seconded by Kim Gleason. And let me just say, I think we all got this message from Drew Gradinger, who's the director of the school, who points out that they've been operating for 25 years and they love their district partners. So I just thought I would pass on that compliment. Any discussion, Kim?
I'm just wondering with whom, like or if it applies, the truancy requirements to report, maybe Secretary French, or someone can help us understand how that works with an independent school and student attendance.
In my experience, and in this region, I will attest that Manchester Village School has been a great partner over the years. This is where I was superintendent. Typically, that kind of interest shows up in the reconciliation of invoices, of attendance, who is there and who is not, and it's the district's responsibility to take that to the next step in terms of a truancy affidavit.
So, and I'm not thinking about it from a punitive standpoint. I'm just, I wasn't even thinking about it from a billing standpoint, but I'm not sure what kind of timeline that looks like. I just know that as much as it wasn't ever something that anybody felt great about needing to do, and a lot of work happened between districts and principals and otherwise with students and families struggling with attendance, there is an obligation, I think, in law for reporting on truancy if you were a school district, a public school district reporting. And so I'm trying to figure out what timely reporting would, if the LEA remains the responsible party, what timely loop has that in a process?
I can speak from my experience, Kim, is that the schools in communication with the family at 4, 7, and 10-day absences. Once we hit the 7 point, we're in communication with the district. And then at 10, if we have decided that there's a real concern here, that it's not like they're on a family vacation or there's not like an extended illness, that it's actually looks like truancy, we report it to the LEA, and then we work with them to solve that problem. But there's communication frequently between the LEA and the independent school, especially once you get to the 10-day limit.
So, and I know that Drew is on the phone, and he said that he'd also be willing to answer this question.
I would just say it's not germane to the approval discussion. Probably should be an item warned for a separate. I'm just thinking of the public's interest in your deliberations as a board. If you want to discuss truancy at a future date, we're very interested in improving our framework in that regard. Be happy to contribute to a discussion there, but I don't, from my perspective, see it central to your decision on their approval or not.
Just
there's nothing unique about this school's handling of truancy that would inform your decision making, in my perspective, on their approval.
It was just among the things that the report from the AOE highlighted as a concern. So
Sure.
That was where, in particular to this, generally that was what prompted the question for process. But the notion you mentioned the billing, which I didn't even think about, but the context of the tuitioning and billing and approval and attendance, I think, do bear on the decision. So I was just curious how that's resolved and with whom that responsibility lies.
Any further discussion? Okay, hearing none. Tom, you've read the motion. Was there a second?
Kim seconded.
Okay, thank you. So at this point, all those in favor of approving the motion, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposition? Any abstentions? All right, the motion is carried, and thank you. All right, so this takes us up to future meeting planning. Just pull
Can I
up.
just ask one more question, because it was left out there that the agency was going to follow up to determine whether or not the actions had been taken regarding attendance, and in a relatively small school, as several being noted as attendance concerns. Is that something that the agency has done, will do? It wasn't a condition. It wasn't conditioned for our approval. I'm just wondering how that loop gets closed.
Yeah, I'll have to get back with my team on that. I'm not sure the status of that at the moment.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so just looking forward to some upcoming meetings and agenda items. Once the doodle poll, I think, has been handed in, we're going to set a meeting for next week to have a 2-hour discussion about DQS and quality assurance. I think we're also planning to have a special meeting subsequently sometime into February about the EQS, and looking forward to our February monthly meeting. The Spalding High School Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion presentation is now scheduled for February, as well as an update from the Special Education State Advisory Panel. I'm thinking, based on our earlier conversation, that it might be helpful for me to reach out to my local superintendent about the work that she's done, to have conversations with independent schools about, complying with the rules that went into effect last May, and have her come in and share her approach, if that seems like that would be helpful for board members and frankly, for members of the public, because I'm sure that there are other school districts out there that, could pattern, based off of this approach. So I'm happy to get that work, rolling. Anything else? And I think independent of the special meeting about EQS, we're probably going to have a big chunk of time, probably at our February board meeting, hopefully to finalize the draft before starting the formal APA rulemaking process. And independent school approvals. Anything else? Great. So at this point, I don't know if there are any members of the public who are out there who wish to be heard. So hearing none.
There may be somebody on the line, Chair Samuelson. They would just need to hit *5 to raise their hand and *6 to unmute.
Suzanne, are you able to see if they're trying or if they're just listening?
It doesn't look like they've tried, so they must just be listening in.
Okay. All right. Well, with nothing further pending, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved by Kim. Is there a second?
Seconded by Patrick.
Seconded by Patrick. All those in favor, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
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 All right. We stand in adjournment. Thank you all very much. Take care.
Thank you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.